Hello and welcome to the 6th lecture of the series Basic Cognitive Processes. I am Dr. Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur. We are still talking about the foundational assumptions in cognitive psychology today. If you remember, in the last 2 lectures we talked about the behaviorist assumptions. In the most recent lecture we talked about the cognitivist perspective on the human behavior. We also talked about how a functional description of mental events is actually taken as the main point in cognitive psychology. In today's lecture, we would actually move towards a different kind of a dichotomy, something which you might have heard, obviously something you might have already heard is this hardware and software distinction that we make between the mind and the brain. This is probably one of the most used analogies borrowed from computer science, but something which kind of also has its own assumptions. So, let us examine those assumptions and see how they help us in understanding this relationship between mind and behavior. Now, hardware, if you see, it refers to any physical device that is either a computer itself or it is a peripheral, like your mouse, your keyboard, things like that. Software refers to the programs that run on the computer. So, there is this distinction between what a hardware is and what a software is. Now, we know that because computer is a physical device, but its programs are abstract. So, whatever the computer does is actually abstract, that is what the software part is. So, we talk about the software generally without reference to the physical hardware of the computer. So, whenever we say for example, I saw this movie on the computer. Okay, we do not really talk about that there was a disk going round and round in the DVD player of the computer which led me to watch the movie. We generally just say we saw the movie on the computer. So, we generally talking about just the software part, not really referring to the hardware part all the time. This is pretty much what we can actually do about the human behavior or human mind as well. We can very well and comfortably talk about the different mental functions without always referring to the what is happening in the hardware or the neural part, that is your brain. Okay. So, if you adopt such a functional approach for the human mind behavior, we can actually say something to the effect like the mind is to the brain as the program is to the hardware. Okay, this is something which was given by Searle. It was his statement. He said that in around 1994. So, cognitive psychologists actually endeavor to understand these programs. They want to understand the programs that collectively make up the mental activity. Okay, which is what basically is then can be described as the flow charts of the mind. So, what what all things happen, what all decisions take place in the mental world, in the mental states that leads to particular kinds of behavior. Say for example, you might be feeling sad, that sadness leads you to feeling hungry, and if you are hungry you overeat, things like that. So, we will be talking about, and we generally, so the idea is that this is the general level of explanation or general currency of conversation that really cognitive psychologists engage in. Okay, let me take an example here. Let us not talk about the brain for a while, let us talk about a thermostat, a rather simple device. Now, here you can see a flow chart of how the thermostat actually functions. So, if at the top you can see that the thermostat needs to start, and the first step that it will take is actually it will read the thermostat box. What is the temperature that is being registered at the thermostat box? The second thing is it then reads the actual room temperature wherever the thermostat is actually placed. Okay, you can do that by help of a thermometer or some other kind of sensor. The second thing that can, the thing after that, the third step that can happen is that it compares the two temperatures. So, it compares the temperature T of the thermostat box to the temperature R, which is the room temperature. So, the question could be like, is T less than or equal to R? And there could be two possibilities. Okay, if the temperature T is not less than or equal to R, that is room is too cold, then what you do is then the heater gets on, then the thermostat actually takes a decision that the heater needs to go on, so that we increase the R to the to the level of the T, which is the thermostat box. Or in another scenario, what might happen is that the temperature T is less than or equal to R, that is room is actually too hot now. So, what it might need to do is it will switch off the heater, and this is what can keep on happening in a cycle in terms of wherever you place the thermostat. Okay. Now you see here I just talked about the decisions and the calculations and the evaluations that the thermostat box was doing without really referring to what is the details of the sensor that really measures the temperature, what is the detail of the machine that really compares these two temperatures. Pretty much what we aim to do in cognitive psychology as well. We do not really, I mean, to an extent we do not really want to talk about the neural structures all the time. Obviously we do, and obviously we need to do that for a full explanation, but our our discussions of mental states and human behavior are not limited by that. Let us take that in mind. Now if you see the last diagram, well, the last diagram gives us an idea of the functional parameters of a thermostat. It needs to be supplemented with the knowledge of the actual physical components as well. Okay. If you just give the last diagram, which is the flow chart, to somebody, it might not suffice to really give him an actual explanation of what the thermostat is about. Then he would know that how the thermostat functions, but say for example there is somebody who has never seen a thermostat. Okay. So, you would need to supply them additionally with the knowledge of the actual physical components that are required to build up a thermostat. So, that is where the whole experience of the thermostat for some individual, for some person, really gets completed. Now, the problem with the human behavior or human mind and this is slightly more complex. When you consider human cognition, we already have a device ready, we already have our brains. So, we do not really really know what are the different components and how are they attached, and those kind of structural connections etc. are not really known to the best possible level. Okay. What we are trying to figure out as cognitive psychologists is just what is going on, what is happening in the different areas of the brain, and how these different areas of the how activity in the different areas of the brain is leading to particular kinds of behavior. That is what we are trying to do. So, in a sense you could say that we are actually trying to do a kind of a reverse engineering. Okay. We are not trying to build up something, but we are trying to in some sense deconstruct something. Okay. So, we are trying to understand how the workings of the brain underpin the human mind. You are actually really talking about how the workings of the brain you really underpin the mind. So, for example, how this mind really can be, how can mind be explained by different neural activities that are going on in the brain. That is what we are trying to do. So, in some sense you could also say that there is this big jigsaw puzzle kind of a thing that is your human mind, and this big jigsaw solving enterprise is what cognitive psychology is actually about. So, for some people it can be very interesting, for some others it might be a bit dry, but the whole idea is that it is rather fascinating to understand how this human mind is made up on the basis of these different neural activities. We do not really know what the nature of this human mind is, we are just looking at something which is componential in nature, which is the human brain, and how that is really leading to the human mind. There are obviously debates on this issue, and that basically go on in the field of study called philosophy of mind, which might also interest some of you. So, we have to begin by accepting in the first place that the brain is slightly more complicated than thermostats and beam balances. So, at least that is one assumption that you begin with. Then what we need to do is to talk about concerns relating to mental states, representations and process. How is the brain representing the outside world? How is the brain leading to these different mental states, and how is the brain actually leading to the interactions between these mental states? If you remember an earlier example that I took, William felt hungry and he decided to make a sandwich. How is the brain really supporting this kind of an interaction? How is the brain going from feeling hungry to deciding to make a sandwich to actually doing all that is required to make a sandwich? That is what we are actually interested in here. By analogy, these things seem very similar to what goes on in a computer. Okay, representations and process, and how is the computer really representing these different numbers, how are these calculations really happening, those kind of that is why the computer hardware software analogy is actually taken to explain the mind brain relationship sometimes. Okay. Also something interesting that one needs to understand is how how does the brain really work in processing information. So how is the brain really regarded as a information processing system? We will talk about that as we go ahead in this course. Then we need to talk about the information from the world. How does the information from the world, that is your input, the codes that represent this input, that is the representation, and how the responses are generated, that is the output. So I am trying to liken the human brain to what the computer is. So there is input, which is information from the world, there is this representation processes, the algorithms, and then there is an output, that a response is being generated. Now somebody who has done an excellent job of actually explaining these interactions and relationships was David Marr. In 1982, David Marr actually came out with these 3 possible levels of explanation of the kind of interaction we are talking about, the mind and the brain interaction. He said that there are 3 levels at which you can actually explain this interaction. Okay. So first level which he gave was the level of computational theory. The second level that he gave was the level of algorithm. The third level that he gave was the level of implementation. We will see each of them as we go ahead now. At the level of computational theory, you are basically concerned with what is that the device needs to do and how is and why is it doing it. Okay. Here is where Marr spells out something which is the logic of strategy. How do you go about doing something? Okay, you are not doing it yet, you are not really exactly planning all the steps, but how do you need to do it? How do you need to, say for example, make tea? Okay, you need to have milk, water, tea and sugar. Okay, this is your computational. You know that these 4 things are needed to make tea. Okay, so let us take another example for now. So how does a calculator carry out arithmetic operations? Analysis at this level will actually address the fact that the calculator carries out these various arithmetic calculations and the fact that it needs a particular method to carry out these calculations. The fact that it does and the fact that there has to be a method. Okay. When we talk about the method, we will go to the next level. Say, just talking about the computational part a bit more. For example, if you have this early HP calculator, this basically used to use a method called reverse Polish. So if you give it an expression like 1 plus 2 multiplied by 3 and 1 plus 2 is in parenthesis, then you would need to enter these like 1, 2 and 3, you enter all the numbers first and then you actually enter the operators. Okay. This is basically known as the PostFixed notation. So the computational level explanation or the computational theory basically in this will be concerned with issues like why do you need to use reverse Polish here and what are the underlying principles of reverse Polish that you actually use here to solve that problem or to explain that problem in some sense. Okay, that is your computational level, that is your computational level of explanation. What do we need ahead? Then we need a algorithm. How do you really implement these steps? Okay. So this is the level or the representation algorithm level is the level where questions are actually asked about the nature of the calculator's operating system. What kind of a operating system is there? What are the steps that it will take and the manner in which the numbers are represented, embodied in the device. Okay. So we are talking about a calculator here. So how information is stored and how arithmetic operations are instantiated. Say for example, how does a calculator store number 2, 3, 4 and how does it invoke the addition and those kind of things. Those things we are actually talking about when we are talking about the algorithm and the representation level. More simply put, how in any information, so if you just leave the example of the calculator for a while and talk about any information processing system, the question will be that how in any information processing system the information from the outside world is represented. Okay. Say for example, we see a lot of things, how the picture of or how this object right in front of me is represented in my eyes or in my brain. What are those aspects in my eyes and in the brain that are actually helping me code the object outside which I am actually seeing. That is the level of representation that you need to be talking about. Coming back to the calculator example, say for example, when number 2 is entered into the calculator, it is represented by some form of this electronic code. Now this electronic code is what represents number 2, that is your internal representation level. by analogy, when we talk about the mind, the mental states basically need to represent the actual states in the world. As I said, if you are actually watching a flower in the if you are walking in the garden and you see a flower, if you see a rose for example, there will be a representation of the color and the shape of the rose in your head through your eyes, which basically you will then process and say for example have memories about and stuff. But the first step or the most basic step is, how is that color red represented? Okay, that is what is the level of representation, and that is what basically this level of representation is all about. Now what happens to when you have represented red? Okay, when you have a set of codes or say set of neurons that fire to code red, what do you do after that? What ahead? Okay, so what ahead basically is explained in the level of algorithm. Okay, the level of algorithm basically helps you specify the set of operations that are carried out on those representations. So you combine the red and you combine the shape, and then you then have a complete perception of what a rose is. Similarly, say for example you have to make tea, you know that tea and sugar and milk and water are needed. The next step will be, how do you really combine them to come up with tea? Okay, you will need to know the algorithm, the exact sequence of steps that you will need to take in order to be able to make tea. Okay. So in computer science, this word algorithm is mainly used interchangeably with the word called program. It's pretty much the same thing, how something is really being done. So if you entered a plus sign into the calculator, and it is working properly, then what it should do is it should invoke the addition algorithm. Okay, so you typed 1, 2, 3 and then you typed a plus sign. The plus sign should invoke the addition algorithm for these numbers that are there. So the plus sign is telling the computer that invoke the addition algorithm for these representation of numbers that I have already had. Okay. So understanding what does this addition algorithm comprise of? This addition algorithm basically comprises of the sequence of operations that determine that how these two numbers are going to be added. So then is where you are actually talking about how a particular function is taking place, how this addition is really happening. So understanding a calculator then, if you really want to understand and get a good picture of what the calculator does, really depends on trying to specify the nature of the internal representations, how is the calculator representing numbers, and the associated process, how is the calculator actually really adding up stuff. Okay, this is what you want to talk about when you are talking about the representation and algorithmic level. Now in terms of, if you leave the calculator and the tea making example aside and you come back to the cognition example, come back to how mind and behavior are to be explained, then what we need to do is we really need to consider both mental processes and mental representations and mental processes. How is the mind representing depth, how is the mind representing color, how is the mind representing shapes, and then what it does to combine those color and shape and depth information to really give you a full perception of, say for example if there is a person, if there is a place, how do you navigate through a park. All of those kind of things basically are coming from this atomic level of representation. Okay, that is something which is one of the most important questions that is there in cognitive psychology, that cognitive psychology attempts to explain. In this respect, by the way, the functional account should not only provide a flow chart that maps out the relationship between these different component processes, but also it gives you some description of the sorts of internal representations that are implicated. Okay. So when you talk about a flow chart like we talked about in the example of the thermostat, the flow chart should also have that this is how a particular shape or a flower or something, the particular color is represented, and this is how it will be combined, and that is what will lead you to the full perception or experience of the flower. Okay. Coming to the third level is actually when you really get on to doing things, how something is really implemented. For example, in the case of the thermostat, what is the sensor exactly, what is the sensor that is really measuring the temperature of the room, something like that. So at the hardware implementation level, concerns are about how the designated representations and processes are implemented physically, those kind of explanations, all those kinds of issues. So what physical components are needed to build up the thermostat? Now this is if you talk about the human brain and you talk about mind and stuff, this is pretty much slightly out of the scope of our discussion. Probably that is more suited to a class of neuroscience. I will not really be talking about a lot in detail about these things, but let me go to a slightly related but a different issue. Okay, we will talk about some explanation still is deserved, that is what we will talk about now. So if we accept some version of the central state identity theory, the fact that mental events and neural events are related, then we are accepting that mental states or processes are nothing but these neural processes. So a particular neuron fires, that leads to a particular kind of a memory or a particular kind of a feeling, happiness or sadness, and that is what we are talking about. Now this you remember can be a rather strong position to take, okay, and there are certain doubts and debates about that. This kind of theory, basically this kind of an explanatory stance is called reductionism. So according to reductionists, what they say is that understanding the human mind can be reduced to understanding the basic electrochemical states and processes that characterizes the behavior of neurons. Okay. Say for example, if you completely understand how a neuron functions, and if you completely understand how the functioning of a neuron affects another neuron and how this these all neurons are connected together, then you do not really need to worry about mental states at all. It is pretty much that neuron X will fire and neuron Y will follow and neuron Z will also follow, and that will lead to the perception of that. So then why do you need to have the perception thing there? You can just say that particular neurons firing lead to particular kinds of behavior. Okay, that if you really follow rather strongly can kind of creates problems for cognitive psychology. Okay, so if we and it kind of is takes you to the assumption that if you understand these physical states completely, you have understood what the mind is. Okay, that is the position some of the people in the discipline would like to take as well. This is one version. Another version of reductionism, by the way, is called eliminative materialism. Eliminative materialism, as Patricia Churchland states, is that once we have a full understanding of the behavior of neurons in terms of basic electrochemical principles, we can then eliminate any mention of the description of of any other level of description. Then you do not really need to talk about any other levels at all. Okay, so that is pretty much what is rather similar to the earlier explanation of reductionism that I gave. Now the point is, the question that you would you should ask yourselves, and the question that you should spend some time wondering about is that maybe then we can get rid of the mind even. What we can just say is that these are the reactions that are going on in the brain, and these reactions are directly leading to those kind of behaviors. So you do not really need to have the mind. Last thing we were saying that those could be helped to explain the mind, but here I am saying that why mind, why consider mind at all? You can just consider that these particular interactions of the neurons, and these are happening due to various neurochemicals, some hormones are released, some neurotransmitters are released, something or some or physical or chemical explanations there, and that is pretty much what is leading to particular kinds of behavior. There is no need of having the mind or mental states or all of that. It is a slightly harder stance, this is called eliminative materialism, a more harder stance of what reductionism is about. Now if this happens, if say for example at some point of time, I do not think that time is anywhere near, but at some point in time if the neuroscientists really go to that level and they understand completely what the functionings of different parts of the brain are, what each of the neuron is doing, how they are connected, how the different neurotransmitters, hormones etc. are controlling these neurons. If that level of expertise and knowledge is reached, then what would cognitive psychologists do? I mean, then we are out of job practically. We do not have stuff to talk about. But there could be some solace. We are actually not focusing ourselves on that anyways. Even if one has a complete account of the nature and operation of neurons, then also this is a completely different level of explanation than what cognitive psychologists actually engage in. We never said that we want to be concerned about how the neuron functions in the first place. We are just saying that we are actually operating at a slightly different level. even if you understand how a particular neuron functions and how different connections lead to particular behaviors, we are not really concerned with that. We are saying that this we can say that okay, this kind of activity in the nerve cells or in neurons or in certain regions of the brain lead to this kind of behavior, and there will be an intervening level of explanation that we will be talking about. That is what cognitive psychology anyways is about. Okay, so as cognitive psychologists, and that is something which should be sure to all of us, is as cognitive psychologists we are interested in uncovering the functional architecture of the mental components that constitute the minds. We just want to know that what leads to what. Say for example, how a memory can lead to a particular experience. Those kind of things. Okay, so the flow charts and how a particular decision is taken, how different mental events are connected, those kind of things we are actually worried about. Okay, so at some point you will see how limitations of attention can lead to sometimes faulty perceptions, those kind of things. The entire explanation is then based in mental states, and that is where our model successfully rests. Completely or if not completely, but reasonably sure of or reasonably distant from these dependence on the neural states. That pretty much what cognitive psychology is about. So this basically brings me to the end of this series of foundational assumptions in cognitive psychology. This was the third lecture in this series, and so just to sum up, we are talking about how mental functions can be represented in the analogy of the hardware and software. We also talked about these different levels of description that exist, which Marr gave, and we talked about how these could lead to a different kind of a discourse about mental functions. So this is the end of the session on foundational assumptions of cognitive psychology. We will go towards the some other kinds of approaches to study cognitive psychology in the next class. Thank you.